The first thing I saw was the wooden handle of a baseball bat trembling inches from my face while my father screamed that I owed this family $10 million. And the second thing I saw was the realization in his eyes that he genuinely believed it. My name is Kira Holt, and the moment that bat swung past my cheek, slicing the air so close, I felt the shockwave hit my skin. I understood something I should have understood years ago. My family never saw me as a daughter. I was a wallet with legs. I was a solution to problems I never created. I was a last resort they felt entitled to. I was standing in my own garage, the one place I had always considered safe, and it was filled with smoke from something my brother Leo had knocked off a shelf. My mother was shouting orders like she was directing a demolition crew, telling my father where to hit next, while Leo kicked over a stack of storage bins I'd spent months organizing. Plastic, cracked metal clattered, and the smell of dust and burnt rubber stung my nose. Leo shoved his phone toward me as he recorded himself destroying my property, his voice full of cruel delight as he yelled that since I refused to sell my house, they were going to make sure there was nothing left to sell. He wanted proof evidence that he could show whoever he owed money to so he could blame me for everything. His grin stretched too wide, the same grin he used when he wanted something for free, when he needed saving, when he expected me to fix another disaster he had created. For once, I felt nothing. No fear, no sadness, no trembling sense of obligation. I felt something colder, steadier, sharper. My father smashed my toolbox next, splintering the wood and sending screws scattering across the concrete. He shouted that a good daughter would sacrifice everything for her brother, that I had betrayed the family, that I had turned my back on blood. My mother echoed every word, pointing at my face, calling me ungrateful, selfish, heartless, saying that a real woman would know how to step aside and let the men in the family survive. Every word she spat was a reminder of every time she told me I was less because I was a girl, every time she praised Leo for simply existing while I worked 2 jobs to pay off debts they created. And still, I stood still. My hands were calm at my sides, even when my father raised the bat again and shouted that this was my fault, that the $10 million Leo owed was my responsibility, that if I had warned him earlier, advised him better, given him money sooner, none of this would have happened. The neighbors gathered outside. I could hear them yelling for someone to call 911 phones, raised recording everything. A few of them shouted my name, but I could not take my eyes off my family because in that moment they were strangers wearing familiar faces. Something slid across the floor, a black folder, my black folder. Leo had grabbed it from a shelf without knowing what it contained. He had tossed it aside like trash, like everything in my life meant nothing if it did not serve him. It popped open when it hit the ground papers, spilling slightly. My father stepped on it without noticing. None of them realized what they had thrown away. None of them knew that inside that folder were confidential documents tied to a cybersecurity case I had worked on for a Fortune 100 company, a case involving a $70 million data breach, a case that had resulted in restricted stock units worth far more than they could ever imagine. They did not know they were stomping on the foundation of a future they never believed I could build. They did not know they were destroying proof of a life they never supported. They did not know that the one thing I had kept hidden from them was the one thing that would protect me in the end. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady enough to silence the room. "You have no idea what you just destroyed." Leo froze mid-step. My father lowered the bat a few inches. My mother blinked like she did not understand English anymore. Sirens echoed down the street. The blue and red lights washed over the garage as officers ran toward us, shouting commands, hands on their belts. My father turned to me with sudden fear, his face collapsing from rage into panic. My mother clung to his arm. Leo looked around like a child who realizes the game is over. And then all 3 of them looked at me the exact same way, like I was the only person who could save them, like I owed them rescue, like I owed them everything. I met their eyes one by one and answered with the only truth I had left. I don't owe you anything. I did not sleep the night after the garage incident, not because I was scared, but because something inside me had shifted so completely that silence felt louder than their shouting had been. And when the sun came up over Tacoma the next morning, I realized I finally saw my family for who they had always been. Not protectors, not guides, but people who believed they were entitled to everything I built. And that realization followed me all the way to South Lake Union, where the glass towers reflected a world I had carved out stone by stone without them. My name is Kira Holt, 29 years old, a data security analyst for a multinational tech firm whose name I never say aloud at family gatherings, because the last time I did, my mother told me it sounded like bragging, and my father asked why a girl like me was trusted with anything important, comments that used to sting deeply, but now fall into place, like puzzle pieces that explain everything. Every morning I commute from Tacoma, a blue-collar sprawl where people work double shifts and mind their business, to the sleek waterfront of Seattle, where I spend my days analyzing breaches, reading log trails, and reminding executives that cyber attacks do not care about their confidence. And even though the commute is long, I chose Tacoma for a reason, because the little house I bought there was the first real boundary I ever set in my life. 4 walls that belonged to me, and me alone walls I paid for with years of sacrifice starting long before adulthood. My home office sits in the back of the house, the room I painted soft gray during the first week after moving in, carefully hanging whiteboards and monitors, telling myself that this was my future, and nobody would take it from me, though I did not yet understand how violently my own family would try. The Holt family is not complicated, but they are exhausting. My mother, Donna, has a voice that can slice through drywall and a talent for turning every achievement of mine into an insult, insisting that ambition in a daughter is unattractive, insisting that helping Leo is the only proof I love my family. My father, Walter, is a man who grew up in a world where sons are kings and daughters are utilities, a man who never learned to speak without commanding, a man who believes every choice I make must be filtered through what is best for his son, never what is best for me. And then there is Leo, my older brother by 2 years, but treated like the youngest and most fragile jewel, the Holt bloodline ever produced, a boy who became a man without responsibility, attached someone who could quit a job after 2 days and still be celebrated for having tried someone who failed again and again, yet always landed on a mattress built from my parents' excuses and my mother's emotional blackmail. The seed of injustice that grew into the nightmare I live now was planted long ago, long before the $10 million disaster, long before the baseball bats, long before the world saw the truth. It began the day my mother entered my room when I was 17 and took my college fund without asking, explaining that Leo had made a mistake and needed help, saying that family is supposed to sacrifice, saying that I should be proud to support my brother, saying that there would be more money later, though there never was. I learned that night that my future could be rewritten, without my consent, rewritten, to save the person they valued, more rewritten, because I was the child they expected to endure. I worked 2 jobs through community college, spending mornings at a coffee shop and nights sorting documents in a warehouse, telling myself the exhaustion would one day be worth it, telling myself that once I built a career, nobody could take anything from me again, though I should have known my family would try. What nobody in that house knew, what I never told them, was that after I graduated and pushed my way into the cybersecurity world, I landed on a team that handled one of the biggest breaches our company had ever seen, a $70 million data mess with global media coverage, a case that required me to pull 20-hour shifts, sleep in conference rooms, and track intruders through a maze of malicious code that would have sunk us if we had missed even one detail. When the crisis ended, the company rewarded a small group of us with restricted stock units, not flashy, not liquid, but significant enough to change the course of my life. once they matured, significant enough to give me the financial stability that allowed me to purchase my Tacoma home at 28, while my family assumed I must have gotten lucky or received help from a man because to them, a daughter cannot win without belonging to someone. The beauty of secrecy is that nobody knows where your strength comes from. They only see the results, and because my family never believed I was capable of anything meaningful, they never questioned how I bought the house so young. They never questioned how I paid for renovations. They never questioned how I always stayed calm when they tried to provoke me. All they saw was a daughter they considered inferior, doing better than the son they worshipped, and nothing enrages people like them more than seeing the person they dismissed rise quietly beyond their reach. Looking back now, I can identify the precise moment the injustice became unbearable, the moment I realized I had spent my entire life cleaning up after other people's choices, while they treated me like the backup generator for their failures. It was not the stolen college fund or the late-night phone calls asking for money or the guilt trips about being single or the pressure to save Leo from his own disintegration, though each of those moments chipped away at something inside me. The final push came the day I bought my house and invited them over, believing foolishly that maybe pride would replace resentment, only to have my mother walk into my home and say it was too nice for someone like me. My father asked why I needed so much space when I would never have a family of my own, and Leo wander through the rooms, calculating aloud how much the house would sell for if I ever decided to help him. I remember standing in the living room with my keys still in my hand and realizing they would never see me as anything but a resource, never see my effort, never see the battles I fought alone, never see me as equal, never see me as family. And yet somehow I still did not expect how far they would eventually go. Thanksgiving in Tacoma had always carried a heaviness for me, a kind of quiet dread that settled in my stomach days before the holiday even arrived, and that year only a few weeks before the garage incident that would expose everything. The tension felt sharper, thicker, almost predictive, though I still walked into my parents' house with a store-bought pie in my hands and the foolish hope that maybe this year would be different. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon should have felt comforting. Yet the moment I stepped through the doorway, I sensed the familiar shift in atmosphere, the way conversations dulled for a split second as people noticed I had arrived, the way their eyes swept over me, not with warmth, but with assessment. And then the murmurs resumed with a slightly louder edge, the kind that always made me feel like an outsider in the house where I grew up. I barely had time to take off my coat before my mother Donna drifted toward me with the sharp smile she used whenever she was preparing to humiliate someone, and she announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear that her daughter thought she was grown enough to buy a house even though she was still single, a statement she delivered as if it were a crime against nature. And as soon as the words left her mouth, she added another line meant to draw blood, saying that a woman without a husband should probably start with something smaller instead of pretending she needed space. Laughter burst from the dining table, the kind of laughter that is not joyful, but cruel, and a few relatives lifted their phones to record the moment as though my embarrassment were entertainment to replay later, and I stood still, forcing my breath to stay steady, while my mother basked in the attention as if degrading me somehow elevated her. Leo appeared then, sweeping in with the exaggerated swagger he used whenever he wanted to perform for an audience, and he slapped me lightly on the shoulder as if we were close, immediately launching into a loud monologue about some new project he claimed would make him a millionaire by spring, describing investors' algorithms and market timing with vocabulary he barely understood. Yet the room hung on every word, showering him with praise, as though he were some type of financial prodigy, instead of the man who had walked away from his last 3 jobs because he said waking up early damaged his creativity. I watched him raise a champagne glass someone had handed him, watched my parents grin proudly like they had produced a genius. And I wondered if I was the only person in that room who could see how desperately he needed validation, how hard he tried to distract everyone from the truth that he had never accomplished anything sustainable in his life. When my aunt asked me how work was going, I answered honestly, telling her that managing threat reports and intrusion attempts had been exhausting lately, that I had been called into late-night emergency calls after a wave of suspicious activity on our servers, that I had barely slept some weeks and was feeling drained. But before she could respond, my mother cut in with a laugh, sharp enough to slice through the air, telling me not to be dramatic, because all I did was sit in front of a computer all day, implying that real work involves sweat and physical labor, and she told the entire room that I had always exaggerated things to make myself sound important. The laughter that followed was louder this time, almost gleeful, and I felt my cheeks warm not from shame anymore, but from the familiar tightening of rage that comes when someone disrespects you in front of people who should have defended you. I glanced at Leo, then hoping maybe he would at least attempt to de-escalate the tension, but instead he leaned back in his chair, lifted his voice above the chatter, and dropped a bomb with the ease of someone who enjoyed watching me fall apart. He announced that he suspected I had more money than I claimed, saying he had done some quick math and guessed my house was worth at least $700,000, adding that someone who pretended to struggle could not have bought a place like mine without hiding something, and he raised his voice even louder to make sure the relatives in the next room could hear, turning my financial privacy into a spectacle. The room quieted in a way that felt predatory, like everyone was recalibrating their opinion of me in real time, and within seconds, I could see the shift in their expressions. The curiosity edged with greed, the sudden interest in what I owned, what I earned, what they thought I might be withholding from them. My mother chimed in with a knowing sigh, telling the family she had always suspected I had secrets, and a few people nodded as though they agreed, as though my habit of keeping my life separate from theirs must have meant I was hiding piles of cash instead of protecting my peace. I felt something tighten inside me, a mix of disbelief and clarity, because in the moment that crowd turned silent and stared at me as if I were a vault waiting to be cracked open, I finally understood that the worst part of being humiliated by your own family is not the sting of their words, but the realization that it was never accidental that they enjoyed it, that they preferred me small, quiet, and manageable. And now that they suspected I was not, they would not stop until they found a way to control what they believed I had. I stood there gripping the edge of the table, listening to Leo brag about things he had never achieved, while the rest of them calculated my worth like I was a property listing instead of a person. And in that moment, surrounded by people who shared my last name and none of my loyalty, I realized the injustice that had shaped my entire life was not growing darker, it was simply becoming visible. I should have known that the humiliation at Thanksgiving was not an isolated moment, but a warning, a subtle shift in the air that hinted at something darker forming behind the scenes. Because only 2 weeks later, Leo called me at 6 a.m. with the dramatic urgency of someone who believed the world revolved around him. And the moment I answered, he launched into a panicked tirade that made no sense. At first, words tumbling out so quickly, I had to sit up in bed and press the phone to my ear as he explained that the investment syndicate, he had joined the one he had bragged about endlessly during the holiday, had suddenly frozen its accounts and stopped responding, and he insisted it had to be a temporary glitch caused by market volatility or a cyber threat or anything except the truth. When he finally paused for breath, I asked him who had convinced him to join something so vague and risky, and he muttered something about a friend of a friend who promised him an accelerated return that only a fool would question. And as he described the way he had signed multiple papers without reading them fully, my stomach dropped because I already sensed this was not a minor panic, but something catastrophic. My suspicions were confirmed when he admitted he had taken out a massive loan, $10 million to be exact, through a private lender who offered what he called a special interest arrangement, a phrase that made me close my eyes because anyone with basic financial literacy would recognize it as predatory. Leo kept talking, describing how he thought he could triple his money in 6 months, how he had planned to pay off the loan before our parents ever knew, and how he had trusted the syndicate because they had used sleek branding and professional language that made him feel like he was entering an elite world of wealth. As the reality sank in, Leo shifted from panic to blame in a matter of seconds, accusing everyone and everything except himself, saying the economy had sabotaged him, the government had misled him, the lenders had lied, and finally he turned his fury toward me, claiming that someone like me, who worked in cybersecurity, should have warned him about scammers, even though he never asked for my opinion and would not have listened if I had tried. I sat at my kitchen table staring out the window at the gray Tacoma sky, listening to the weight of his irresponsibility crash over me. And before I could respond, he handed the phone to my mother, who was already shouting, demanding to know why I had not monitored Leo's decisions more closely, insisting that if I could protect billion-dollar corporations from cyber threats, then surely I could have prevented my own brother from making a mistake. And she delivered this accusation with the righteous certainty of someone who refused to acknowledge her son's pattern of self-destruction. I heard my father in the background pacing, raising his voice, asking how such a disaster could happen, while I sat calmly in my own home, implying that my independence meant I had abandoned the family, and I felt the old, familiar pressure in my chest, the sense that their chaos was inches away from spilling into my life again. When I told them firmly that Leo's choices were not my responsibility, my mother's tone shifted into something more dangerous, a manufactured softness she used whenever she was preparing to manipulate, and she said she understood I was stressed, but that families were supposed to support each other, especially in emergencies, and that Leo was drowning and needed all of us to help him stay afloat. I recognized the setup immediately, the way she was trying to corral me toward an obligation she had no right to impose. And when I asked her what she meant, she dodged the question, suddenly claiming she had things to do and would call back later. I felt uneasy after that call, a prickling sense that something had already been taken from me. And that intuition proved correct only 2 days later, when I received an automated alert from my bank notifying me that my emergency savings account had been accessed. At first, I assumed it was fraud from an external source, but when I opened the transaction history, my breath caught, because the withdrawal was only $12,000, a specific amount that a stranger would have no reason to choose. And the password used was an old one, something I had created as a teenager, something only my mother could have remembered because she had once helped me set up that account during high school. My pulse quickened, a slow burn of disbelief turning into fury as I realized she had used a moment of vulnerability to steal from me. And when I confronted her, she denied it at first, with the smooth confidence of someone who had practiced lying for decades. Then she switched to justification, insisting she had not stolen anything, but merely borrowed a small amount to help Leo stabilize his situation until things improved. She even tried to make it sound noble, claiming that a daughter should be willing to sacrifice a little for her brother. And she dismissed the violation as if she had borrowed a sweater instead of breaking into my bank account. I told her calmly but firmly that what she did was illegal, that she had violated my privacy, that she had crossed a boundary that could not be undone, and as soon as she realized I was not backing down, she raised her voice, calling me ungrateful, cold, selfish, accusing me of turning my back on family during their darkest moment. My father chimed in behind her, shouting that if I had nothing to hide, I should not care about a small withdrawal, and Leo yelled something incoherent about how I owed him for all the times he had supported me emotionally, a claim so absurd I almost laughed, and the argument spiraled quickly into a cacophony of blame and entitlement. I ended the call, trembling not from fear, but from the dawning clarity that my family had crossed a threshold, that their desperation had metastasized into something reckless and dangerous, and for the first time I allowed myself to consider that what they wanted was not forgiveness or understanding, but access to my resources and the life I had built without them. I should have expected that the fight over the stolen $12,000 would be only the beginning, because when my family wanted something, they always escalated rather than retreated. And only a week after that explosive phone call, I woke up to the sound of multiple car doors slamming outside my house in Tacoma, a sound too coordinated to be accidental. And when I stepped onto my porch, I saw my parents, my brother, and 3 cousins standing in the middle of my front yard, like some kind of intervention squad. Their faces tight with determination, as if they were preparing to stage a rescue mission rather than ambush me. The morning was cold and gray, the kind of Washington chill that sinks into your bones. But my mother, Donna, was dressed like she was headed to a church. Potluck, arms crossed, lips, pursed, her voice already raised before I had even walked down the steps. And she announced loudly that they were there because I had forced their hand by being stubborn and selfish, declaring that the family was in crisis and I needed to step up before everything collapsed. My father, Walter, stood beside her, hands on his hips, radiating the authority he believed he naturally possessed, and he pointed at my house as if it were an object he had a right to command, telling me that a good daughter would have already sold it to help her brother, questioning why I was clinging to something that he insisted never should have belonged to me in the first place. My cousins hovered behind them, shifting uncomfortably, but not enough to leave clearly there as witnesses to pressure me, and I felt my stomach knot as I realized they had assembled a small crowd, not because they needed support, but because they wanted an audience. Leo stepped forward dramatically, his expression contorted with desperation that felt almost theatrical. And before I could even greet anyone, he fell to his knees in the middle of my lawn, lifting his hands in an exaggerated display of sorrow, pleading with me to save him, because the lenders were threatening him, saying he would be ruined if I did not cooperate. And he kept repeating that families were supposed to sacrifice for each other, while looking around as if checking whether everyone saw him performing his role. My mother clutched her chest as though watching her son kneel in the grass was breaking her heart, and she gestured toward him dramatically, telling me that if I had an ounce of compassion, I would at least listen, insisting that I owed it to the family to make things right. My father added that daughters were supposed to invest in the home front before they chased their own ambitions, and he delivered this statement with the smug certainty of someone who believed gender roles were divine law. Then he asked why I even needed a house of my own when I was unmarried, and would eventually follow a husband's lead anyway, words so absurd they might have been laughable if the situation had not felt so hostile. I felt a sting in my chest, not because their logic wounded me, but because the way they said it revealed how little they thought of the life I had fought to build. And when I calmly explained that I was not selling my home, my mother snapped that refusing to help was proof that success had turned me cold, insisting that I had become greedy, distant, unrecognizable. Leo seized the moment to intensify the performance, clutching at the hem of his jeans, shaking dramatically as if he were collapsing under the weight of his imaginary burden. And then he did something I never saw coming. He pulled out his phone, opened a live stream, and aimed it directly at my face, while theatrically telling his online audience that his sister was abandoning the family during their darkest moment. I froze for half a second as I realized hundreds of strangers were suddenly watching me stand in my own yard, while my brother manipulated the narrative, and the comment section began filling instantly with people who knew nothing about the situation, yet typed accusations about how heartless I was. And Leo made sure his viewers could see my house behind me, pointing at it dramatically as he explained that I refused to sell it, even though doing so could save him from ruin. When I told him to turn the phone off, he lifted the volume of his voice, repeating that line again and again until the neighbors began peeking through blinds and stepping onto porches, watching me with confused and judgmental eyes. Because all they saw was a crying man kneeling and a woman standing firm and silent, and I felt my dignity slipping away like sand through my fingers. One neighbor even shouted across the street asking whether everything was all right. But before I could answer, Leo shouted back that he was just trying to keep our family from falling apart, and he painted me as someone who had cut them off for no reason, leaving me too stunned to respond quickly enough to reclaim the narrative. Within minutes, someone online found my professional LinkedIn profile. Someone else found my street name, and I began receiving messages through a spam account warning me that I should be ashamed for letting my own family drown. And although none of the information leaked was deeply personal, the violation felt real and invasive, the kind of digital intrusion that chips away at your sense of safety. I stood there on my lawn surrounded by relatives who looked at me like I was the villain of a story they had invented together, and as I watched Leo tilt the phone to catch every angle of my refusal, I felt something inside me crystallize a shift from disbelief to a quiet, simmering certainty that the line between desperation and entitlement had snapped completely, leaving a version of my family that no longer cared about truth or boundaries, only results. And in that moment, as my brother broadcast my private life to strangers, and my parents demanded a house I had worked for alone, I understood clearly that the people surrounding me did not want my help. They wanted my life, and they would not stop until they took as much of it as they could. I thought the live stream humiliation would be the peak of their aggression, yet what happened after proved that when people like my family sensed they were losing control, they shifted from manipulation to intrusion with a speed that could take your breath away. And only 3 days after the public scene in my yard, I returned home from a long shift in Seattle to find my front door slightly ajar. Not enough to look like a break-in, but just enough to make my pulse spike as I stepped into the hallway and noticed that the air felt strange, as if someone else had been breathing in the same space hours earlier. At first glance, nothing looked stolen. Nothing seemed overturned. But as I walked slowly toward the living room, I felt an unsettling tug in my memory, a faint awareness that something was off. And it took me several seconds to realize the framed photo that usually sat on my bookshelf had been moved 2 inches to the right, a detail anyone else would have overlooked, but one that stopped me cold because I arranged my home with methodical precision. My stomach tightened as I scanned the rest of the room and found similar subtle disturbances. My throw blanket folded differently, a coaster placed on the wrong side of the table, a small ceramic bowl turned in the opposite direction, and the more I looked, the more I felt the eerie sensation that someone had walked through my house, slowly, deliberately touching. Something in every room not enough to cause visible damage, but enough to let me know I was no longer the only person who controlled this space. When I hurried to check the security settings on my back door, I found what I had feared, but had not dared to say aloud. The old spare key that my mother had kept back when I first bought the house had been used a key I thought she had discarded when I changed the locks, but apparently she had made a copy years ago, something I realized with a mix of dread and resignation, because this was exactly the type of covert boundary crossing she excelled at. I felt my chest tighten as I rushed through the rooms, checking drawers and closets, and when I reached my bedroom, I saw the unmistakable proof that this was not a simple trespass, but something far more calculated, because my family had taken photos of my interior snapshots of my furniture and electronics and wardrobe, and had already uploaded them to the family group chat with comments that made bile rise in my throat. Messages mocking how comfortable my life looked, calling me spoiled and selfish, saying that someone who lived this well should not hesitate to sacrifice for family, and I could almost hear their voices in those texts, dripping with resentment and entitlement. The most chilling part was not that they invaded my space, but that they wanted me to know they had done it. They wanted to destabilize me to make me question my own safety inside my home. And as I absorbed the reality that they had not only entered without permission but had touched my belongings, arranged them just enough to make me feel watched, I sensed a slow simmer of anger rising beneath my initial shock, a quiet fury that sharpened my awareness instead of blinding it. That anger intensified when I walked to my small office and discovered a far more dangerous violation. My property tax card, the document that confirmed legal ownership of my home, had been taken from the drawer where I kept it, leaving a faint outline of dust where it had once rested, and in that instant, I knew with sickening clarity that they had not come simply to intimidate me or guilt-trip me. They had come with the intention of impersonating me, of submitting fraudulent paperwork that could complicate the ownership records of my house, something that could drag me into legal battles, or worse, something that meant they were willing to risk criminal charges if it meant getting their hands on what they believed I owed them. I sank into the chair, breathing slowly to keep the panic from overtaking me, and as I pieced together their pattern of escalation, the live stream, the intrusion, the financial theft, I understood that waiting for them to stop on their own was not just naive, it was dangerous. I realized I needed to gather evidence, not because I wanted revenge yet, but because I knew the situation was headed toward an inevitable confrontation, and the only way to protect myself was to document every violation meticulously. So I did what someone in my field would naturally do, using my technical skills in a way that was entirely legal and quietly effective. I purchased a set of discrete cameras designed for home monitoring, small enough to blend into shelves and vents and decorative corners, and I installed them throughout my house with angles that would capture anyone entering, touching or moving anything inside my space. I placed one above the doorway where the old key had been used, another pointed toward my office drawers, and a final one in the hallway where anyone passing between rooms would be recorded clearly, all of them synced to a secure cloud account that only I could access. Then I took another step that felt equally necessary. I slipped a small AirTag under the back seat of Leo's car during a moment when his attention was elsewhere. Not because I wanted to stalk him or seek confrontation, but because I needed to know whether he or my parents planned to return to my house again, and because tracking the locations they visited could reveal if they were meeting someone involved in the fraudulent paperwork. Every action I took was within the law, quiet, discreet, and deeply grounded in everyday American life. Something any woman living alone and protecting her property would understand instinctively. And as I finished setting up the final device, I felt something shift inside me, a calm resolve forming beneath the exhaustion, the realization that protecting myself did not require shouting or pleading, it required strategy. And for the first time since everything began, I understood that while my family relied on chaos and emotional blackmail, I had something they did not, the ability to gather proof, to think several steps ahead, and to stay composed while they unraveled. And that realization marked the first true moment where revenge stopped being an abstract thought and began taking shape as a quiet, deliberate plan. The week after discovering the missing property tax card felt like slipping into a tunnel where every source of light dimmed one by one, and even though I told myself to stay focused and calm, the consequences of my family's actions began seeping into parts of my life I thought were insulated, starting with work, the one place that had always felt predictable, and structured a world built on logic rather than emotion. On Monday morning, shortly after I arrived at the South Lake Union office, I noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in the way people looked at me. A stiffness in their smiles, a hesitation in their greetings, the kind of quiet avoidance that usually follows gossip, and I caught snippets of conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked past, leaving behind the heavy residue of unspoken accusations. At first, I tried to dismiss it as paranoia from the home invasion stress, but the moment I sat down at my desk, my coworker, someone who used to chat easily with me, closed her laptop suddenly and muttered that she had a meeting, walking away so quickly she nearly bumped into another desk. And in that moment, I realized the isolation was not accidental, but targeted. My suspicions were confirmed that afternoon when I received an email from HR asking me to come in for a brief conversation. a phrase that in corporate language usually means something is wrong, and as I walked into the small conference room, I saw the HR manager wearing a polite, tight smile, her tone careful in the way people speak when they are trying to avoid legal complications. She told me that anonymous reports had been submitted, suggesting I had accessed banking information belonging to a family member without consent, something so outrageous I actually blinked in disbelief. And she explained that while the company was not making any accusations, they needed to remind employees about the importance of separating personal and professional boundaries. Her voice soft, but her eyes measuring every reaction I made. I managed to stay calm, explaining that I had never done anything of that sort, and that the report was likely malicious. But the humiliation of sitting in that room while my integrity was quietly questioned left a lingering sting, a reminder of how easily rumors could erode the stability of a career built on trust. When I returned to my desk, the isolation had thickened, coworkers whispering behind half-closed cubicles, and I felt the walls of my professional life tighten around me, making me wonder just how far Leo had gone in spreading lies. The answer arrived sooner than expected, coming in the form of a call transferred directly to my office line, a call from a man whose voice was sharp and brittle, introducing himself as one of the private lenders involved in Leo's $10 million mess, and he did not bother with courtesy, as he demanded to know when I planned to help resolve the debt, since my family had made it clear I was the one with resources. I froze, gripping the edge of my desk, trying to process the absurdity of the accusation as he continued speaking, saying Leo had assured them that I was responsible for advising him on investments, that I had inside knowledge because of my cybersecurity position, and that if I did not cooperate, they would have to consider whether my role made me complicit. His tone carried a threat that sent a cold rush down my spine. And before I could fully respond, he warned that he knew where I worked and would not hesitate to contact my superiors if necessary, implying all kinds of consequences, without naming any directly, the kind of vague menace that catches in your bloodstream and spreads fear slowly. After the call ended, my hands trembled, and I could almost feel the last stable part of my life beginning to tilt. Because the lender's threats were not just empty intimidation, they were dangerous enough that any employer would take them seriously, especially in my field where even the slightest suspicion could lead to internal audits. Not even an hour later, the email arrived from IT security, informing me that my access to certain systems would be temporarily paused while a minor procedural review was conducted, a phrase that felt like a blow to the ribs because losing access in a cybersecurity department is not minor. It is humiliating. It is public. It tells everyone around you that something in your world is unraveling. When I tried to log into one of our monitoring dashboards, the system denied me, flashing a message that made my throat tighten, and the awareness that people around me saw it too made the isolation heavier, turning the open office space into a silent battlefield where I stood completely alone. I walked to the restroom and locked myself in a stall, gripping the metal door to steady my breathing, feeling as if the sabotage from my family had expanded into every corner of my life, turning coworkers into skeptics, HR into watchdogs, lenders into threats, and my workplace into a place where I no longer felt protected. It struck me then how frighteningly easy it was for a handful of lies to unravel years of work, how quickly a reputation could be stained when others were willing to weaponize fear and suspicion against you, and the sense of isolation wrapped itself around me like a tightening coil. Yet as the minutes passed and the initial wave of despair softened, another sensation began to rise inside me, something quieter, but far more solid. The realization that what was happening was not just chaos or misfortune, it was a clear pattern, a deliberate push designed to corner me, to pressure me, to break me down until I surrendered the house or the money or whatever they believed I owed. And in that murky moment of exhaustion and clarity, standing alone in a restroom stall, with my access suspended and my reputation under attack, I recognized that I was being forced into a place where reaction was no longer enough, that I was being pushed toward a transformation I had resisted for years, and that the dark tunnel swallowing me was not a dead end but the beginning of an arc I had not asked for, but would finish. I dried my hands, slowly looked at my reflection, and understood with a certainty that surprised even me that I was no longer simply defending myself. I was entering the stage where revenge stops being emotional and becomes strategic. A quiet, calculated arc where every injustice becomes fuel and every attack becomes evidence. By the time my mother announced the so-called final family meeting, framed as an emergency gathering, meant to fix everything before it spiraled further out of control, I already sensed that the event would not be a conversation, but an ambush. Yet I still drove to her house in Tacoma because a part of me needed to see just how far they were willing to go. And when I stepped inside the living room, the heavy silence that greeted me felt staged, as if they had rehearsed their positions before I arrived. My mother, Donna, sat rigidly at the head of the table with a stack of documents neatly arranged in front of her. My father, Walter, paced near the window with the tension of a man preparing for confrontation, and Leo leaned against the back of a chair pretending to wipe tears from his face, even though his eyes were completely dry. And as I took my seat, I noticed that the rest of the extended family had gathered as well, forming a semicircle behind the main trio, their presence clearly intended to increase the pressure. The table between us was bare except for a single folder, and when my mother pushed it toward me with the solemnity of a judge, delivering a sentence, I felt my heart beat slow in preparation for whatever manipulation was coming next. She told me in a trembling voice that it was time for me to stop being stubborn, that the family could not survive unless I stepped up, and that inside the folder was the paperwork needed to put my house on the market immediately. Her tone shifting between pleading and commanding in a way that hinted at months of bottled resentment. I opened the folder and saw a printed contract prepared by a discount real estate service already partially filled out with my property. Address, my name, and my forged initials in a few spots that made the blood drain from my face as I realized how far they had gone. When I pushed the papers back across the table, Leo moved quickly to block my hand, shaking his head dramatically and insisting that this was the only way for us to remain a family, saying that once he paid off the $10 million debt, everything would go back to normal. And he added that my refusal to help was tearing them apart, turning me into the villain of my own bloodline. I stood up slowly, intending to walk away, but my father moved with surprising speed to block my path to the door, his hand snatching my phone from my grasp with the reflexes of someone who had been planning this moment, telling me I would not leave until I signed because they could no longer trust me to make rational choices on my own. My mother began to raise her voice in quick bursts, accusing me of abandoning the values she claimed she had raised me with, shouting that daughters were expected to sacrifice for their brothers, that women were meant to support their families even when it hurt, and she repeated over and over that refusing to sign meant I no longer cared about them. Her words increasing in pitch until they filled the small room with the shrill weight of her expectations. The relatives behind her nodded like spectators, encouraging a performance, and I felt the pressure crowding the air until it became difficult to breathe, my mind flashing back to every childhood moment where I had been guilted into obedience, every dismissal of my achievements, every time I had been told that my worth was measured only in how much I could give away. Someone closed the curtains as if preparing the scene for something more intense, and Leo positioned himself directly in front of the doorway, arms spread, eyes narrowing with an expression that bordered on triumphant, because he seemed convinced that this time he had cornered me. My father held my phone in one hand while tapping the table with the other, urging me to be reasonable, to stop acting like some self-righteous stranger and start thinking about what the family needed. And my mother leaned forward, her voice cracking with both rage and desperation, shouting that real daughters sacrifice, without questioning that loyalty meant doing what you were told, that refusing to sign was not only selfish, but unforgivable. For a brief moment, the room blurred, and I felt the weight of all their voices pounding against me like a physical force. But somewhere underneath that pressure, a quiet and growing stillness formed, not numbness, but clarity. A firm recognition that the person they were attacking was not the person I had fought to become. I felt my spine straighten as if something inside me had aligned, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out steadier than I expected, soft but powerful in a way that cut through their shouting, and I said a single word that stopped the room cold. No. The silence that followed was immediate and electric, a stunned stillness, as if they had never imagined I might reject them openly. And for the first time in my life, I watched their expressions shift as they realized they were losing control. My father asked me to repeat myself, disbelief widening his eyes, and I met his stare without blinking as I said the rest of the sentence that had been forming inside me for years, telling them I did not belong to a family that saw me only as a resource, that I was done being the sacrifice they felt entitled to, that whatever bond had existed between us had been severed the moment they chose greed over honesty. My mother's face twisted with fury as she rose from her chair, and before anyone could react, she struck me across the face with a slap so sharp my head snapped to the side, the sound echoing through the room in a way that made several relatives gasp, and the sting spread across my cheek in a hot bloom that pulsed with both pain and recognition, because the slap was not only an act of violence, but a confession. She had shown me exactly who she was. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply reached into my pocket for my backup phone, the one she had not taken, and with calm precision I lifted it and pressed record, capturing the room. The faces, the slap mark forming on my cheek, the stunned expressions the curtain pulled shut to hide their actions from the neighborhood, all of it becoming evidence that would later serve a purpose none of them could foresee. When I stepped around Leo and walked out the door, he did not stop me, perhaps too shocked by my composure to act. And as I crossed the yard, I noticed Mrs. Henderson next door standing on her porch, holding her own phone, recording everything silently. Her eyes wide with the kind of expression people wear when they realize a story they have watched from afar has finally revealed its truth. And as I got into my car, my cheek burning, my heartbeat steady, I understood that this moment was not the breaking point they intended. It was the turning point I needed. In the days that followed the final family meeting, the air around me seemed to change its temperature and texture, as if the world itself had shifted on its axis. Because once you say no to people who have built their entire identity around controlling you, their panic begins to escalate in unpredictable waves, and that was exactly what happened with my family as reality finally collided with the fantasies they had constructed to keep themselves afloat. The first sign came on a cold Thursday morning when Leo called repeatedly from different numbers, which I ignored until an unfamiliar voice left a voicemail informing me that a formal lawsuit had been filed against him by several members of the so-called investment syndicate that he had confidently bragged about to everyone during Thanksgiving. And when I listened to the message twice, I realized that this was not an empty threat or a misunderstanding, but the beginning of a full-scale financial collapse for him. By that afternoon, I began receiving forwarded links from coworkers showing online threads where Leo's name appeared in long lists of individuals involved in fraudulent schemes and bankruptcy claims, and the expressions on my colleagues' faces when they walked past my desk told me that the story had already spread far beyond the family circles, reaching communities that took such matters seriously enough to discuss them publicly. And for the first time, I saw the truth of what my brother had been hiding behind his theatrical arrogance. The following week was a blur of frantic activity from my parents, who seemed incapable of grasping that Leo's downfall was the result of his own decisions rather than a direct consequence of my refusal to sell my house, and they called every mutual acquaintance, insisting that I had betrayed the family, accusing me of sabotaging Leo's opportunities, claiming I had refused to support them during a crisis I had supposedly helped create. Donna left long voice messages dripping with a kind of desperate venom, insisting that a good daughter would have come running the moment things got difficult, and Walter added his own line of reasoning, arguing that I was the only one with a stable job and therefore had a moral obligation to rescue them, his tone sharp and commanding, as if fatherhood automatically entitled him to my labor. I did not respond to a single message because I had already learned the cost of engaging with their panic, and instead I focused on strengthening the boundaries I had started building months prior, beginning with the decision that delivered the most immediate and irreversible shift in power, the transfer of my home into a revocable, living trust. I met with my attorney on a rainy Monday morning in downtown Seattle, the kind of gray, misty day that made the skyscrapers look blurred at the edges, and she walked me through each step of transferring the deed into the Holt Evergreen Living Trust, a name we intentionally chose to sound unassuming enough that no outsider would tie it directly to me without digging through legal layers that would require authorization they would never receive. She explained that placing the property inside the trust effectively severed any hypothetical access Leo believed he had through family ties or emotional manipulation, and once the paperwork was signed and notarized, she handed me a sealed folder containing copies of the recorded documents telling me that this simple but strategically powerful move would prevent anyone from using my home as leverage ever again. As I walked back to my car with the folder tucked under my arm, I felt an unfamiliar sense of safety, as if a heavy stone had rolled away from the part of my chest that had been carrying the weight of their demands for too long. And although I knew they would react explosively once they discovered they could no longer weaponize my property, I also knew that for the first time in years, the foundation of my life belonged entirely to me. Their reaction came quickly and violently, metaphorically, rather than physically this time, through a long email my mother sent at 3 a.m, accusing me of trying to ruin the family name, insisting that a house belonged to the people who raised the owner, not to some legal construct, and when Walter added his own message, accusing me of hiding assets and acting like a stranger, I could almost see the way their illusions were crumbling. Leo's message arrived last a sloppy mix of rage and fear, in which he demanded access to the house documents, insisting he had a right to review what I was doing because he was still my brother and because the house was part of the family legacy, a phrase that would have been laughable if it were not so absurdly detached from reality. I read the message once, then locked my phone and let the silence settle around me, thinking about how for years I had taken responsibility for the chaos they created, pouring my time and earnings into their mistakes. Yet in their eyes, nothing had changed because they still believed they could control me as long as they spoke loudly enough or pointed fingers with enough confidence. Meanwhile, the legal and financial storm around Leo grew more violent each day as creditors began filing claims, former friends distanced themselves, and the people he had convinced to invest alongside him demanded explanations he could not give, and it became clear that the collapse was not temporary, but structural, a complete unraveling of a life built entirely on bravado and borrowed money. The more their world imploded, the more they blamed me, not because I had caused any of it, but because they needed a villain, someone to hold responsible for the consequences of their own actions, and they clung to the narrative that I was selfish and ungrateful because it shielded them from the unbearable truth that they had enabled Leo for so long that he no longer knew how to stand on his own. Yet beneath all that noise, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet resolve that was stronger than the finality of the no. I had spoken during the family meeting a realization that I had moved from being their victim to being the witness of their downfall, and that their unraveling was no longer my burden to carry. And as the trust documents settled into their drawer in my home office, protected behind a lock only I had the key to, I understood that this was not merely a legal maneuver, but a declaration of independence, the first irreversible step in reclaiming the life they had spent years trying to control. The night of the community meeting arrived with a heaviness that settled over my shoulders, like wet fabric, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel measured. And as I walked toward the HOA building with a folder tucked under my arm, I sensed that this evening would either expose the full truth or bury me beneath another wave of lies. But I no longer felt fear, because the trust transfer had already cut the most dangerous cord. The HOA room was already full when I entered neighbors occupying the metal folding chairs, arranged in rows, some talking in low murmurs, others watching me with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. And at the front table sat the HOA board members whose stiff expressions told me they had been warned that some sort of dramatic family conflict might erupt tonight. My mother, Donna, sat in the center of the first row, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a crafted blend of disappointment and fragile sadness, while Walter sat next to her, tapping his foot anxiously, and Leo occupied a seat just behind them, hunched forward, jaw-clenched eyes darting around the room as if scanning for threats. I took a seat near the back, intending to stay quiet unless necessary. But before the meeting could move into its regular agenda, my mother lifted her hand in a dramatic gesture and immediately stood without being acknowledged, launching into a speech with the force of someone who had rehearsed her performance in the mirror. She told the room in a trembling voice that she did not want to embarrass her daughter, but she had no choice that families sometimes struggled quietly and that community was about helping each other. And then she shifted with a sudden sharpness, saying that I had abandoned them, that I refused to help in a time of crisis, that I valued money more than blood. And a few people gasped softly, because she delivered the lines with such conviction that anyone who did not know the backstory might have believed her. The HOA president tried to interrupt, asking her to sit down and respect the agenda, but Donna waved a hand dramatically and insisted that the neighbors deserved to know what kind of person I truly was, and she added loudly that my brother was being hounded by dangerous creditors, and that I refused to lift a finger to help even though I lived comfortably in a house that should belong to the family. Her voice rising to a piercing pitch that filled the hall. I felt the room tilt slightly as all eyes shifted toward me, some filled with judgment, others with curiosity, and for a moment my throat tightened with the familiar instinct to defend myself, to explain, to justify. But then an unexpected calm washed over me, because I realized I held something she did not expect, something undeniable. I stood slowly, walked toward the front, and rested my folder gently on the table, where the board members sat, telling them I would like to respond, if granted a moment, and when they nodded, I turned to face the crowd with a steadiness that surprised even me. I began not with emotion, but with facts, the kind that cannot be twisted or diluted, and I opened the folder to pull out the printed transcripts of threatening messages sent by my parents, and Leo reading them aloud in a measured voice that made the words feel colder than when I first received them, each line revealing the entitlement and manipulation behind their demands. I then took out my phone and played a short clip captured from my hidden camera, showing my parents inside my home without permission, rifling through my belongings, taking pictures of my property, and speaking casually about how to force me into selling the house. And the room shifted again, this time with the murmuring sound of collective discomfort, as neighbors exchanged looks that bordered on disbelief. My mother sputtered and tried to interrupt, claiming the footage was taken out of context, but I continued without acknowledging her, pulling out the printout that showed the withdrawal from my emergency savings, the one she had accessed using the old password she memorized from my teenage years, and I explained calmly how that money was taken under the excuse of a temporary loan that was never returned, a detail that made several homeowners suck in sharp breaths, because financial violation is something people in this community understood deeply. Then I placed another sheet on the table, a timestamped screenshot of the message chain between Leo and his so-called investors, including the line where he bragged about receiving $10 million from a syndicate that he believed would make him rich, and the line where he admitted to forging signatures to secure part of the funds. The room fell completely silent for 3 long seconds, the kind of silence that feels heavy and brittle, and then a voice from the back echoed through the hall in a deep, controlled tone, asking if he could speak. A tall man in a dark jacket stepped forward, and when he introduced himself as one of the primary creditors pursuing Leo, the tension in the room cracked like ice under weight, because suddenly the story became more than a family dispute. It became a matter of public accountability. He explained that Leo had lied to numerous people, that he had misrepresented investment terms, that legal action was already underway, and he added that it was unacceptable for my family to scapegoat me for consequences tied directly to Leo's actions, his voice firm enough that even the HOA board leaned forward. My mother stood abruptly and pointed at him, shouting that he was twisting everything, that he was persecuting her son. But the room no longer believed her, and several neighbors turned away from her with thin-lipped expressions that signaled moral disapproval. One woman in the front row, whom I barely knew beyond polite greetings, stood and said loudly that she had witnessed my family banging on my door late at night, screaming accusations for everyone to hear, and she added that she always suspected something deeper was happening. Another neighbor raised his hand and said he had captured video of them trespassing on my property weeks before, and that he would be willing to share it if needed for legal purposes. And with each statement, the room shifted farther away from my parents' narrative until their version crumbled entirely. My father attempted to stand and speak, but the HOA president instructed him to sit down, stating that the meeting would not allow further personal attacks now that evidence had been presented, and then he turned to me and thanked me for bringing clarity to the situation, assuring me that the community would support me if anything further occurred. As I gathered my folder and stepped back, dozens of eyes followed me, but this time the expressions were different, a mixture of sympathy, outrage on my behalf, and quiet respect. And when I left the building into the cool night air, I felt a sense of vindication settle into me like steady warmth, not triumphant or loud, but deeply grounding, because the truth had finally been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses who would not forget what they heard. The fallout from the HOA meeting had barely settled when the next catastrophe erupted, a disaster so reckless and surreal that even now, remembering it, feels like watching a scene from someone else's life, yet it was mine, fully and painfully, because when people who feel entitled lose control, they often escalate in the most destructive ways, and that was exactly what happened with my family when they finally realized that every tactic of manipulation, guilt, and public shaming had failed to force me into selling my house. After the exposure at the HOA meeting, they went quiet for 3 full days, an unnatural silence that felt less like retreat and more like a storm gathering behind closed doors. And though my instincts warned me that something dangerous was building, I could not imagine the scale of what they were planning, because I gave them credit for a baseline of logic they simply did not have. On the 4th morning, I woke up before sunrise to a series of notifications on my phone from neighbors in Tacoma, people I barely knew beyond casual greetings, each message containing the same shocking sentence, urging me to check the news or answer urgent calls, and when I opened the first attached video, my breath caught in my throat. The footage was shaky, filmed through a neighbor's window, but the scene was unmistakable. My parents and Leo standing at the front door of what used to be my house, each of them gripping baseball bats, each of them masked not with professionalism, but with raw desperation, and the moment the camera zoomed in, I saw Leo kick the door with the heel of his boot until it swung open. The image jerked as the neighbor gasped, but kept filming, capturing Donna entering, first raising her bat with trembling arms before bringing it down onto a wooden bookshelf. her movements frantic and unsteady while Walter smashed the entryway table with one brutal swing, the wood splintering in a loud crack that echoed even through the recording, and Leo charged toward the living room like a man possessed, swinging wildly at anything within reach. My heart pounded with a sickening rhythm as I realized what they were doing, convinced that if they destroyed the house I refused to sell, I would lose the one thing I had fought to protect, believing that if I had nothing left to hold on to, I would finally surrender and bail Leo out of the mess he had created. Watching them smash furniture, tear photos from walls and overturn the dining table, felt like witnessing the symbolic destruction of every memory I had tried to salvage from my childhood, as if they were ripping apart not just wood and drywall, but the last remnants of whatever connection had existed between us. But the most chilling part was that they did not know one critical fact, the detail that transformed their act of revenge into a catastrophic self-sabotage. They were not inside my house at all. They were inside the home of the man who had purchased it from me weeks earlier. My phone rang again, and this time I answered, because it was the new homeowner, his voice shaking with disbelief and anger, as he explained that he had stepped out for an early morning run and returned to find 3 strangers destroying his living room, while screaming my name as if performing some twisted ritual of vengeance. Before I could apologize or even form a coherent sentence, he added something that froze me completely. His home was covered in cameras, not just the standard doorbell cams that most people in Tacoma used, but a full integrated system installed as part of a cybersecurity upgrade that I had personally overseen for him months before, when I was still helping pilot a residential security program through my company. Every room except bathrooms had high-definition motion-activated recording, each feed automatically backed up to an encrypted cloud with timestamp logs stored off-site, and the cameras captured everything in perfect clarity, from Donna shouting that she would make sure I never dared defy the family again to Leo, screaming that he would destroy every inch of the place until I crawled back, begging for forgiveness. The police arrived 6 minutes after a neighbor called 911, and by the time officers entered the home, the 3 of them were still swinging their bats out of breath and drenched in sweat, surrounded by broken glass and smashed furniture, looking more like frantic burglars than family members seeking justice. They were handcuffed on the spot as they attempted to argue that the house was mine, insisting that they had every right to be there. But the officers quickly confirmed that the new deed had been recorded weeks earlier, and their justification evaporated into stunned silence. When the homeowner told me that the estimated damage was already exceeding $80,000, I felt a wave of horror, because the number was not arbitrary. It was a threshold. Anything above that amount transformed their charges from simple vandalism to felony property destruction, a serious offense that carried real consequences, including potential jail time, fines, restitution, and permanent criminal records. That afternoon, I drove to Tacoma to meet with the homeowner and the detectives assigned to the case. And when they played clips of the footage for me in a small office, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and closure, because seeing my family in high definition committing a crime with such determination made something inside me shift permanently any lingering illusion of who they were shattering like the furniture they had destroyed. The homeowner, a man named Blake Porter, looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and disbelief, telling me he had never imagined something like this could stem from a family dispute. And when the detectives informed him that I had no legal responsibility for any of the damage, he nodded and said he understood. But the sadness in his eyes reminded me how deeply their actions had violated not just his property, but his sense of safety. As I sat there answering questions and explaining the background that had led to this escalation, I felt the weight of years of manipulation ease in a way that was almost physical, because their actions had finally spoken louder than their accusations, louder than their guilt trips. louder than their narratives, and there was no coming back from what they had done, no excuse they could manufacture strong enough to bend reality in their favor again. And when I left the police station that evening with the sun dipping low over the Tacoma skyline, I knew that this was the turning point the story had been building toward, not the moment they broke me, but the moment they broke themselves. The weeks following the raid unfolded with a strange quietness, the kind that comes after a storm has torn through everything and left behind a landscape so altered that even the people who caused the damage cannot recognize where they stand anymore. And as the legal proceedings advanced with mechanical precision, my family's panic began to take on a new and almost pitiful shape. Donna and Walter were placed under strict supervision as part of their plea agreement, required to attend mandated counseling, perform community service, and pay restitution toward the more than $80,000 in damages, while Leo faced the harsher penalties due to his involvement with the investment fraud case, piling on top of the property destruction and the weight of all of those consequences pressed down on them with a force they had never imagined. Their savings evaporated within weeks as they paid attorneys' fines and restitution. Their house went on the market and sold quickly at a loss, and the three of them shared a small rental apartment that barely fit a bed, a couch, and their growing resentment. And although I should have felt vindicated, I mostly felt a hollow sort of clarity, because for the first time I could see them without the fog of obligation or guilt that had clouded my judgment for years. Then came the day I knew would eventually arrive, the day when their pride finally cracked completely, and they reached for the only person they believed could save them, the person they had spent years tearing down. It happened on a gray morning when I was returning from Bellevue after meeting with a senior partner on a new security architecture project, one that hinted at a forthcoming promotion, and as I stepped out of my car, I saw the three of them standing at the edge of my driveway like figures carved out of exhaustion, their postures sagging under the weight of everything they had lost. Donna stepped forward first, wearing a heavy coat that overwhelmed her thin frame, her eyes puffy and red, as if she had been crying for hours, and when she opened her mouth, her voice cracked on my name, the sound so soft and unfamiliar that for a moment I barely recognized her. She told me she was sorry, her words spilling out in fragmented sentences, insisting she did not know what else to do, claiming that everything spiraled beyond her control, and she begged me to help them pay the remaining debts, saying that without my help, they would lose everything, as if everything had not already been lost by their own hands. Walter stayed behind her, his face tight and worn his shoulders stiff, and he attempted to soften his voice by saying that families make mistakes, that sometimes they lose their way, that forgiveness was part of healing. But each word felt insincere, like lines rehearsed in desperation, rather than genuine remorse. And when he stepped closer, I instinctively stepped back, creating a physical boundary that matched the one I had already built emotionally. Leo then joined in, walking to the front with a swagger that had been reduced to a faint shadow of its former arrogance. And he tried to smile as if appealing to sibling nostalgia, telling me that I had always been the smart one, the successful one, the lucky one. And he added that the $10 million debt hanging over his head would not be difficult for me to handle because I was obviously wealthy, the implication clear and sharp. He was beginning to suspect something about the financial layer of my life that I had kept hidden. He asked bluntly where my money came from, suggesting that I must have help from someone, that no one my age could buy a house, pay bills, and live comfortably without some enormous secret, and when I remained silent, his eyes widened with excitement rather than shame, as if he believed he had discovered leverage instead of digging himself deeper into humiliation. Donna looked between us and whispered that they would never ask again if I could just pay off the remaining debt, just this once, she said, even though every previous demand had been labeled just this once, and she repeated that she was sorry so many times the words dissolved into meaningless sound. I let them stand there for several long seconds, while the air hung heavy between us, my silence becoming its own kind of mirror, forcing them to see themselves clearly for the first time. And then I turned without speaking and walked into my house, not slamming the door, not rushing, simply moving with the steadiness of someone no longer shaken by their theatrics, and I returned carrying a thin black folder that held the one document capable of ending this conversation permanently. When I opened the folder in front of them, their expression shifted from confusion to curiosity to dread, and I watched each emotion ripple through them as I unfolded the statement printed on crisp white paper. A document few people outside my company ever saw, the restricted stock summary representing my compensation from the $70 million cybersecurity incident I had helped resolve years earlier. My mother squinted at the page, at first her eyes scanning the unfamiliar line items until she reached the total value at the bottom, and when she did, her hand flew to her mouth as if she had seen something indecent, while Walter's jaw dropped in absolute silence, the numbers so large that his face went pale under the winter light. Leo let out a soft, choked laugh, not because he found it funny, but because disbelief had become too large to swallow, and he muttered something about how unbelievable it was, how I had been hiding it from them, as if concealment itself was the crime rather than everything they had done to justify that secrecy. I waited until their shock thickened into something heavier, something closer to comprehension, and then I spoke in the same calm voice I had used the night of the HOA meeting, telling them simply that everything in that folder was earned, not gifted, not stolen, not owed to anyone but myself, and that not a single cent of it would ever be used to rescue them from the consequences they created. Donna began to cry again, harder this time, insisting that she had been wrong and that she understood now why I guarded my independence so fiercely, but her apology floated in the air like smoke with no substance behind it, because the timing revealed its purpose more clearly than her words ever could. Leo stepped forward, asking if I was really going to let them drown when I had the power to save them with a blink, and his tone slid from pleading to accusing in less than a breath, calling me heartless, selfish, cold, the same insults they had thrown at me for years, but now stripped of power, because I no longer carried the guilt they depended on. I closed the folder slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones, and I told them the final truth they needed to hear, that I had spent years being their safety net, while they shredded every boundary I tried to set, and that this time, the consequences belonged to them, not to me. And when I stepped back inside my house, leaving them standing on the driveway in silence, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a profound sense of peace, because the circle had finally closed, and the person walking away was not the frightened daughter they once controlled, but the woman they never thought I could become. In the months that followed my family's final collapse, I found myself moving through life with a steadiness I had never felt before, a quiet rhythm that emerged as soon as I allowed myself to imagine a future without their voices dictating my choices. And when I finally closed on the Lakeview condo in Bellevue, I felt something inside me exhale for the first time in years, as if my lungs had been holding someone else's expectations the entire time. The condo sat high enough on the slope that each morning the surface of Lake Washington shimmered like soft silver under the sunrise, and standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a mug of coffee, I could watch the water ripple in calm patterns that reminded me what peace actually looked like, not the fragile, temporary silence I used to cling to growing up, but a real expansive stillness that belonged entirely to me. I began establishing new routines, gentle ones that gave shape to my days, joining a gym within walking distance, where the early morning crowd kept to themselves, and created a space where no one cared who I was or what my family had done, each workout becoming an act of reclaiming my body in a way that felt grounding. rather than punishing. And I found a therapist recommended by a colleague who specialized in financial abuse and family enmeshment, a rare combination that fit my story in ways that allowed me to unravel the tangled threads of my past slowly and safely. Therapy sessions became a weekly anchor, a place where I learned to name the things I had endured without minimizing them, where I learned that survival had made me strong, but healing would make me whole. And week by week, the patterns that once felt inevitable began to dissolve into something softer and less defining, leaving room for who I was becoming. As my personal life steadied, so did my professional life. And after the chaos surrounding Leo's creditors, calling my workplace had finally faded. My company began to view the situation with clearer eyes, recognizing that I had never been involved in any wrongdoing, and when the board completed its internal review, they restored my full system access and invited me to lead a new initiative focused on improving security protocols around insider threats. The project was ambitious and high visibility, the kind of work that drew attention from upper leadership, and within months my efforts paid off as I received a promotion to senior security architect, a role that placed me in charge of designing frameworks for large-scale data protection and ensured I could work with the autonomy I had earned through years of diligence. The promotion came with a salary increase, expanded stock options, and a vote of confidence that meant more than any financial gain, a recognition of the value I brought to the company, independent of the chaos my family had tried to attach to my name. And when my director congratulated me, she added that resilience was a strength rarely visible on a resume, but impossible to ignore when demonstrated in real life. Outside of work, I found myself drawn towards something unexpected, a desire to help younger women who were living through circumstances I once thought were unique to me. Women whose families treated them as resources rather than daughters. Women whose ambitions had been diminished by guilt or manipulation, and I began volunteering through a local organization that supported victims of financial abuse. I mentored women in their 20s who were trying to rebuild credit after family members had taken out loans in their names, women who had been pressured into giving away savings, women who were carrying shame that did not belong to them, and each conversation reminded me of who I had once been and why choosing myself had been the only path forward. The more I listened, the more I understood that my story was not rare, but simply rarely spoken out loud, and offering guidance to these women became one of the most meaningful parts of my new life. A steady reminder that healing is an act best shared rather than hidden. As time went on, the updates about my family's situation arrived in small, fragmented pieces, mostly through acquaintances in Tacoma, who still crossed paths with them occasionally, and each new detail painted the same picture of decline. Leo was ultimately convicted of a lesser fraud charge not severe enough for prison, but serious enough to place him under extended supervision and require him to repay significant restitution, a debt he would likely carry for years, given his lack of stable employment, and the irony of his downfall settling legally rather than emotionally was not lost on me. My parents fared no better as their financial troubles deepened, and eventually they were forced to leave Tacoma, entirely relocating to a smaller and far less stable living situation after their debts grew too large to manage each move, shrinking the world they once used to dominate with their demands and expectations. Then one afternoon a letter arrived in my mailbox, handwritten in the looping cursive I recognized immediately as my mother's, a style she had always been proud of, and for a brief second I hesitated turning the envelope in my hands as the memory of her voice echoed faintly in my mind. But curiosity rather than sentiment made me open it. The letter was short, barely half a page, its tone strangely flat as if the words had been drained of their usual emotional force, and it read simply that they were sorry that they understood now what their choices had cost that I had won, and that she hoped I might someday speak to them again. I folded the letter carefully without rereading it and returned it to the envelope before placing it inside a drawer. I rarely opened, not out of anger, but out of clarity. because the person she was asking to forgive them no longer existed in the way she imagined, and the life I had built depended on a boundary stronger than nostalgia. In the evenings, I sometimes sat on my balcony overlooking the lake, watching the lights of passing boats drift softly across the water, and I would think about how different my life felt now compared to the chaos that once defined it, a contrast so sharp it made the past seem like a distant story belonging to another lifetime. And every now and then, when someone asked me if I regretted cutting ties with my family, I would smile quietly to myself, a smile shaped by peace rather than bitterness, because the truth I carried was simple and unwavering. Sometimes the family you walk away from is the price you pay to become unstoppable.